Hey, what's up guys, it's Texumer talking to you here, and today I want to talk about the Intel machines that are still on the market right now. And if you are looking for a bigger type MacBook Pro, do you need to go for a M1 Max or even an Apple Silicon computer? Or are you well settled with an eBay machine or a used machine from Intel from 2016, 2017 with the older type design, which are smaller, thinner and more portable, but have the disadvantage of having Intel inside, which is right now a hot mess on those computers. But for the right price, you can get everything you want to. So let's see and let's compare. Should you go for the more expensive MacBook Pros, especially the 16-inch M1 Max MacBook Pro or even the M1 Pro MacBook Pro, because it's the bigger sized MacBook Pro with the Apple Silicon? Or should you go for a 15-inch or even a used 16-inch with Intel from 2018, 2017 or even 2019? Well, in this video I will cover all of that. I will compare all of these computers. I will compare Apple Silicon against Intel in 2022 and tell you if you should go and buy a used computer or even settle with a new Apple Silicon. But of course, this is a very different and a very difficult decision to make because it's very personal. For me, I would go for Apple Silicon. I will tell you right away, Apple Silicon is the best product right now, even though you get a little bit more expensive when buying Apple Silicon because Intel machines are used now and you can get a lot of discounts on those. But I think that the Apple Silicon is so much better in every single way that it's way worth it to get it, even though you have to spend a little bit more money. But the question gets harder when you think that you want a bigger machine, you want a 15-inch, a 16-inch screen. What you do? Should you go for the Apple Silicon MacBook Pro, which is the M1 Max MacBook Pro with the 16-inch, or even the M1 Pro MacBook Pro with the 16-inch, or should you settle with the used 15-inch MacBook Pro? Because that has Intel, but that's around $700, and it's even cheaper than the current M1 MacBook Air. Well, that's a very different question and a very difficult question to answer in a very short time, so just roll the intro and let's start with it. The current M1 Max or even M1 Pro MacBook Pros are great. They have a new design, they have amazing CPUs like the M1 Max and M1 Pro, they have amazing GPUs, they have a ton of RAM, they have amazing ports, amazing I/O, amazing keyboards, amazing trackpads, amazing displays, which is, in my opinion, the best part of these computers. But they have a problem. They are quite expensive. The base model M1 Pro MacBook Pro 14-inch starts at $2,000, and let me tell you, that's quite a bit more expensive than the current 15-inch or 16-inch machines with Intel used out there. Of course, it depends on the storage and the settings that you get, but for people that only need a 15-inch computer, a bigger sized MacBook Pro, and a portable one to say the least, then it starts to make sense to look for the used market, because those are way cheaper and they still work fine for doing the simple tasks that people need, which is browsing the web, checking email, going to YouTube, Facebook, browsing Chrome. But I think that there's more to that for that question, because not only the MacBook Pros with Apple Silicon are faster on more complex things like video editing, photo editing and playing games, or even 3D rendering, coding, well, these Intel machines are quite slower and quite hotter in other stuff, like browsing the web, like checking emails and doing these simple tasks too. Because this machine works instantaneously. You can go and check this browser test and you can see that this is very, very, very fast. Of course, when compared to an Intel machine, which is quite ridiculously slow, it bridges the gap even further. But of course, if you go and compare this to a 15-inch MacBook Pro and you check maybe for 3 seconds each time, is it worth it to spend an extra $500 to $700? Well, in my opinion, I think it is, because for me, I like things to be very, very fast and very, very efficient, but for most of you, probably don't. So, of course, this is a very different and very question to juggle. Should you go for Intel right now instead of having and going to spend more on Apple Silicon, or should you wait for Apple to release a 15-inch MacBook Pro, which is so much better than finally kill those Intel 15-inch MacBook Pros that are used on the market? Because those are quite a good of a deal right now. If you think and you want a big computer with a big screen, 15-inch is big. And you want a portable computer too. So if you really like that MacBook Air 15-inch prototype and concept, then you probably will love to use this 15-inch MacBook Pro. The Intel machine inside, it's the i9, it overheats, thermally throttles, but it's the same performance around the M1. If you like the M1 performance, talking about the more extremes, not the simple tasks, those I think that the M1 is still faster, like opening the web browser, like checking your emails, because Apple Silicon is so much more optimized for macOS when compared to Intel that there's no even comparison. So, of course, these MacBook Pros with Intel inside, they are quite a bit slower on those tasks, simple tasks to say the least, but they are also worse in a lot of things. If you know, and if you think about it, by spending an extra $1,000 and getting a 14-inch machine, you can get, of course, the M1 Pro, which is way faster than those Intel i9s, and you are way more efficient, you get way better battery life, which is around 20 hours, just ridiculous, one of the best battery lives ever on laptops, only being overpowered by the 16-inch MacBook Pro with the M1, which just costs $400 more. So if you really want to get a more expensive computer, then go for the full-fat M1 Pro 16-inch and enjoy that. That's the perfect option for you. But I do think that at $2,400, that's a bit expensive, and that starts to get way over budget for most of people. But I've seen a lot of 16-inch new MacBook Pros on the wild, and those are quite expensive, even if they are the base model. Those start at $2,400, and those are very expensive. But if there are people willing to pay that kind of money for a big laptop, I'm not assuming that those are all video editors and all of those are 3D renderers and photo editors. So I do believe there's a market for a bigger sized MacBook Pro with a huge screen, not being as powerful as expensive as this M1 Max MacBook Pro. Because although this MacBook Pro is quite good, you can see that it's amazingly screen, it's big, it's evenly sized, it's a newer design with a ton of new ports. Well, I do think that there's a new market for MacBook Pro which is smaller than this, which is a bit thinner, a bit more portable, just like the 15-inch 2018 MacBook Pro. Luke Miani did an amazing comparison between these two computers. You can see here that even though these are the two same MacBook Pros and this 16-inch MacBook Pro is an evolution of the 15-inch MacBook Pro from 2018, the 2018 version with the old design, with butterfly keyboards, with touch bar, was way thinner. Almost half the size and half the footprint. So if you are thinking about it, the 16-inch MacBook Pro and the 14-inch MacBook Pro, they form a lineup. And that 15-inch 2018 Intel machine just fits in the middle. So I do think that there's a line and a space for a 15-inch MacBook Air. But Apple hasn't released one yet. And so we must ask the question, should you go for the Intel machine used and go and opt for a $700 Intel machine with the Intel Core i9, which is very hot? We know that, and it's a fact, that it over throttles, or go for a lot quieter, a lot better battery life, a lot quieter and cooler machine like the M1 Max or even the M1 Pro, MacBook Pros, and just simply spend a little bit more money, get the extra RAM, get the extra keyboard, which is way better, way more reliable to say the least. The Magic Keyboard is way better than the Butterfly keyboard for reliability purposes, and the best screen on the market. This mini LED screen is just insanely good. The colors are crisp, way natural, way better than the old P3 color gamut LCD found on the 15-inch MacBook Pro. But again, like I told you, these computers, they are similar in some ways. Like, of course, this is a 15-inch and this is a 16-inch. This is an evolution of the 15-inch, but they are so much different in other ways. I would put the 15-inch MacBook Pro from 2018 closer to the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch from 2020. Yes, the base model MacBook Pro, the real base model. This MacBook Pro has the M1 chip, has a 13-inch size screen, which is still the P3 LCD color gamut, the same screen found on the 15-inch MacBook Pro, and it has an M1 chip inside. Of course, it still has the touch bar, but it of course needs and has a Magic Keyboard, not the very bad and unreliable Butterfly keyboard. So again, these two are way more similar, because for $1,300 you can get this M1 MacBook Pro, and for around $700 to $800 you can get the base model 15-inch, and for around the same price as this $1,300 M1 MacBook Pro from 2020 you can get the more and most expensive 15-inch MacBook Pro from 2018 with the Intel Core i9. So of course there's a very different decision you have to make. Go for M1 MacBook Pro, which has the 13-inch screen, or go for the 15-inch screen with the Intel machines. But in my opinion, I'm here to recommend you and to guide you. Do not buy an Intel machine right now. Even if it's used, even if it seems a good price, do not buy it. Although Luke Miani shared his experience and said this computer works fine, I don't need to do anything more than that. I think that he missed some points. Good. I think that he missed some points. Mainly the fact that he only used it for 2 weeks and it didn't get into his nerves the fact that this computer was slower doing everything that he does, like searching the web, opening emails. It's slower and noticeably slower than the Apple Silicon computers. Even the M1 MacBook Air is way faster doing those things. And of course, the durability issues. Because you might be thinking, why? Why would you have durability issues on this 2018 MacBook Pro? Well, first startling, the keyboard is really bad on these computers and very unreliable. And in about, I'd say a year, and I think it's during this year, these computers will lose their warranty. What do I mean by that? The fact that these computers have butterfly keyboards only covers them 4 years of repair from Apple. So after the 4th year of buying this computer, your computer loses its warranty in terms of repairing in the repair program for replacing the keyboards. So you are of your own. So if you get stuck keys or completely broken computer, then you are in trouble and your computer is trashable. So this is the first point. Second point, it's an Intel machine. So how much longer do you think Apple will support Intel machines on their lineups with macOS? Well, I'll give it 3 years, not more. So do you really want to buy a 3-year-old or 4-year-old computer which has an unreliable keyboard and it has Intel inside, which is very hot, it's slower, and it has less years of software support for the same price as the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro, which just has a smaller screen, but in otherwise has way better keyboard, way better CPU. It has almost the same I/O. It loses 2 Thunderbolt 2 ports, but you can get a dock and that's issue solved. And it has the same screen, a little bit smaller, but it features, of course, the M1 chip, which is way better and will be supported for years to come. For example, in my opinion, I think that this MacBook Pro will be supported 10 years easily because it's Apple Silicon. Imagine if Apple is supporting their iPhones for 7, how can they do using macOS with Apple Silicon? So again, it's a very different and very hard question to answer. This is a very personal question. If you really don't care about the durability and the age that you will keep your computer, like you want a computer for now, just for use for the next year, of course it makes sense. And if you want a bigger computer, an Intel machine inside, and you really need that bigger screen, and you only have $1,300 to spend, of course, go for the Intel machine. I cannot persuade you by that because that has a 15-inch screen, that has a bigger sized keyboard, better speakers, and it has the same camera. All of the things like the quirks and features, the M1 has way better than that. But the 15-inch MacBook Pro loses in some stuff that is quite important to keep. Of course, in my opinion, don't go for the Intel machines. Never go for the Intel machines from the first day that Apple released Apple Silicon. But if you think that these computers will suit your lifestyle and you don't really care about the lifespan of your computer, then go buy the 15-inch Intel machines or even the older Intel machines for a very cheap price. Grab those, wait until your Apple Silicon computer replacement comes, which right now is just the Mac Pro and the iMac Pro. So if you really need a laptop, go for the M1 Pro, MacBook Pro from $2,000, the full fat M1 Pro and the M1 Pro base price. They don't make a lot of difference. The performance is negligible, and so if you don't care much about the performance but you do like the new hardware from the MacBook Pros and you do love their new I/O, their new screens and their new design, then feel free to go for the $2,000 M1 Pro MacBook Pro base model. You have still the 3 Thunderbolt ports and you still have a ton of new features. The RAM, the storage, the fast storage, the incredible good Mini LED Pro Motion 120Hz display. There's a ton of new features that you get by spending an extra $700 when compared to the maxed out Intel 15-inch MacBook Pro or even the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro. But if we are comparing apples to apples, you have to compare the 15-inch MacBook Pro in terms of price to the M1 MacBook Pro 13-inch, and then if you really need a bigger sized screen, you only have one option, which is the Intel machines right now. But I would urge Apple to release a 15-inch MacBook Air for around $1,500 to bridge the gap between the M1 Pro MacBook Pro at $2,000 and the M1 MacBook Pro at $13,000. So these two base models need a base model MacBook Air which has a bigger 15-inch screen and will attract a ton of people. Just like they are doing this year with the iPhone 14 Max, they are releasing a cheaper priced iPhone which has the biggest screen on their lineup, which is 6.7 inch, just like the iPhone 14 Pro Max will have, but it won't have the extra camera or the premium design and the ProMotion display. So make the same thing just for the MacBook lineup. Make a MacBook Air, or even call it the MacBook, has a 15-inch screen, has the new design, very slim design, 2 Thunderbolt 2 ports, and it has the M2 chip, which will be so much faster than the Intel Core i9 found on the 15-inch MacBook Pro. But if you really need a very slim, a very big screen, and a portable computer, more portable at least than these two, and you really need that 15-inch screen for your workflow for somehow, and you don't really care about performance, and you don't really care about thermal design or battery life, then the 15-inch from 2018 maxed out at $1,300, it's still a good option. Try to find the 2019 for a good price. If you can't, go for the 2018. You will have butterfly keyboards, of course, but do not go for the 16-inch Intel machines. Those are still very, very expensive on the used market, but they are not that good when compared to these computers. So by spending that money on a 16-inch MacBook Pro, simply go for the 14-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro. That's the best option. You will get an insane screen, an insane new design, way more portable computer, and an insanely powerful M1 Pro or even M1 Max chip, depending on which one you choose from, which will give you even better integrated graphics and, of course, CPU power and RAM. And finally, battery life, which is the most important part of these computers and a portable computer, because without battery life, you're simply stuck on a dead body. And of course, these computers are all very expensive, and if you don't have the money to spend on these computers, then simply go for the M1 Mac Mini. That's the best option for you, but keep in mind you have to buy a screen, keyboard and mouse separately, and it won't be portable as a MacBook Pro is. If you really need a MacBook Pro and needs to be portable, but you don't care about everything else, then the M1 MacBook Air is the option for you. I recommend the base model. And if you really need more storage, don't buy from Apple, just buy an SSD, an external one, and use it with your MacBook Air. But those are my recommendations right now and these days. Should you go for Intel in 2022? Of course not. What you are thinking? You don't need Intel right now. Intel is dead for a reason, and please don't buy an Intel machine unless you are forced to, or you really need to, or you really want to buy an Intel machine. But otherwise, just go for Apple Silicon. There's a plethora of Apple Silicon devices that are available right now. There's Apple Refurbished, that's used now. You can buy it second-handed, Best Buy refurbished, Amazon renewed. There's a ton of new and available options for the M1 MacBook Air, the M1 MacBook Pro, the M1 Mac Mini, the M1 Pro MacBook Pro 14-inch, the M1 Pro MacBook Pro 16-inch, the M1 Max MacBook Pro 14-inch, and the M1 Max MacBook Pro 16-inch. So as you can see, there's a ton of new options that you can choose from, and all of these Apple Silicon computers are amazingly optimized for macOS and for their apps. So of course their battery life will be insane. Their screens are really good. The memory and the RAM doesn't really matter because they are very well optimized. And if you think that you need an extensively amount of RAM, like 64 gigabytes, trust me, you don't. Only if you are like those big guys on big studios that has the money to spend, doesn't really care and just throws everything at it. Buy the 64, that may be for you, but for me, the 32, I never had any options and any delays with the 32 gigabyte option, and let me tell, that's overkill. Even if I had the 16 gigabyte option, I wouldn't have any trouble. And if you buy an M1 with the 8 gigabyte option, you won't buy and you won't have any trouble. But I would advise you going for the 60 gigabyte option, because a 16 gigabyte option will give you an even more lifespan, because having more RAM will increase the lifespan of your computer, because in the future the apps will be more heavy and will be more power hungry, and so having a little bit more RAM will assure you that extra life years of your computer. But what are your thoughts on this? Will you go, do you have an Intel machine right now? Will you go buy an Intel machine, or are you just waiting for Apple Silicon computer to come out, the iMac Pro, the Mac Pro, or will you going to buy an Apple Silicon MacBook Pro with right now ton of new options, so much options that you can choose from, since the M1 Mac Mini to the M1 Max MacBook Pro 16-inch, which is this computer right here, which is almost maxed out apart from the RAM. So of course, if you really want to go for an Intel machine, but the idea from this video is do not buy any Intel MacBook Pros right now, and even any Mac, because buying a 27-inch iMac right now is dumb. Buying the Mac Pro 2019, it's the dumbest decision you will make in your life. So just wait and see what will happen. This was Texmer talking to you here. Bye.